Good afternoon for those that have just joined early. We will be just a 5 p.m. UK time, so please bear with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just check, Christina, that the sound comes across okay?
Perfect.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Ian McKechnie. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our field service and servitization webinar that we're having today. We are part of the Advanced Services Group at Aston Business School, and I'm delighted to have some distinguished speakers with us today from Esenta, from Servicerama, and from Aston Business School, with expertise in field service and servitization. If I can move on to the agenda, please, Christina. Today, we're going to be talking about field service and the implications around servitization. We're delighted to have Richard Glover with us today, who's a Senior Industrial Fellow from Aston Business School. We're then going to talk to Kevin Rad and Amit Venugopal from Esenta. Kevin is based in Switzerland and Amit is based in Vancouver, Canada. And they will be talking collectively about the opportunities and challenges from the perspective of challenge partners supporting field service. We will then have a 10-minute open session for questions. Please use the question or the chat function that you have on the screen. This will be a slot just to give you an opportunity to challenge or to request further information from the speakers as they've gone through their presentations today. There'll then be just a quick brief call to action at the end and some information about how you can find out more about the relative speakers and the work that we undertake at the Advanced Services Group. Before I do that, I'll talk just very briefly about who we are. The Advanced Services Group is based at Aston Business School in Birmingham in the UK. We are a group of about 30 strong. We are a centre of excellence on the topics of servitization and advanced services. We provide education and training and research to a global network of like-minded professionals. So the group has been going for just over 10 years now. We work with global manufacturers and technology innovating firms to help them develop their services-led strategies to improve both revenues and margins. We're very fortunate our group is led by our Executive Director, Professor Tim Baines, and Tim is the #1 cited academic in the world for the term servitization and advanced services. One of the things that we wanted to just share today before we moved on was that if you're interested in servitization and the related activities around field service, we have a big showcase event taking place in Birmingham this year in October between the 4th and 6th. It will be our first in-person event since COVID. So there will be invitations to industry to come along and find out what we're doing in this space. There will be keynote speakers from industry talking about what they've done in this space, and also a range of different exhibits where industrial partners will be showing what they've done to actually transform their business through servitization. The speakers we've got today, I'm going to start by introducing Richard Glover. Richard is the Director of Technical Service Consulting. He is also a Senior Industrial Fellow at Aston Business School, but he spent a significant part of his career with Xerox International as Director of Technical Service. And Richard's going to talk to you today about all the different experiences he had in managing 2,000 field service engineers. We've also got Kevin Rad, who's a Director of Service Solutions at Esenta in Zurich. And Kevin has a significant level of expertise around about working with C-suite advisors and customers to help them on the business transformation journey towards digitized aftermarket service and commerce. And finally, we're delighted to have Amit, a board member for Esenta based in Vancouver in Canada. And Amit is the Chief Revenue Officer and has had significant CRM industry experience since way back to 1996. So as we move on, I will now hand over to Richard to give us an opportunity to hear his experiences round about managing an outcome-based field service. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ian. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for joining this afternoon, and thank you for the introduction, Ian. So the reason I'm talking to you today is, as Ian mentioned, I had many years' experience managing a field service operation in Xerox in what we would now call a servitized way. What I wanted to point out to you this afternoon is the opportunities that come with managing in that method of operation. The opportunities are very big, and they bring you opportunities not only in your revenues, but in your management of costs as well in your field operation. So I'm just going to take you through a few of those opportunities now, and just trying to move the slide on. Slide's not moving. Oh, yes, it is now. So why is this an opportunity for you in managing in an outcome-based manner in field service? Well, the first thing is, of course, it can bring you significant new revenue opportunities for the business. More importantly, perhaps, it can bring you a stable annuity revenue stream. Now, that's a brilliant thing, because for any business wanting to plan its gross profit and its overheads, the stability of the revenue stream is key. And I had the great benefit of working in that method of operation for many years. So what does it give you then? It gives you not only that revenue stream, but it enables you to have a deeper and more strategic relationship with your clients, which I know Kevin and Amit will talk a little bit more about later. But very importantly, it gives you full control over your service cost and margin profile. So you own the cost stack in that environment. Now, that can sound like a bit of a big responsibility, but it's also an opportunity, because it gives you fantastic opportunity then to plan ahead for your labor, parts, supply chain strategies, and to manage effective programs to manage your costs and your margins very well. So huge opportunities there if you get this one right. But in any situation like this, a good service starts from good planning at the beginning. So I'm just going to move on to some of the areas that you'll need to focus on as you transition towards a an annuity outcome-based model in your field service. So you really, it would not be wrong to say that if you can never do enough planning of what the field service outcome should be in detail. As in any contract negotiation, the parties will have a slightly different view of what is and is not included. And so you should put in as much effort at the beginning to be very clear on what is or isn't included in the service offering. Because the first people who will discover what's in the service offering are your client and your field service operation. And if we don't do this well, they're going to get some surprises. The only other thing I would point out is that in trying to make a service operation like this efficient, it's possible to make it ever so slightly more efficient than it should be, because you should always just have a little bit of bandwidth for the unexpected on the day, where something has happened in a client operation that you need to be able to respond to. So a bit of headroom and bandwidth are always good to have. So don't make it too tight, but do try to make it precise. There's a few small examples there. Does your customer think they can call you anytime for service, day or night, 365 days? Can they have unlimited callouts? This is a big shift, because in your previous models, perhaps the customer was paying for callouts. And in Xerox, we had a fleet of customers who were not on contracts, and they rarely called us for service, specifically because every callout was a call charge. But as you move towards an outcome-based model, does the customer believe they can have unlimited service callouts? And if they do, how will you manage that operationally? Secondly, is scheduled maintenance included? Is it even necessary? How will data help you going forward in managing scheduled maintenance? Oh, and one other big overhead that often pops in these situations is the need to have very detailed dashboard reporting and account review and account management processes. Now, that's a brilliant thing to have, and it keeps you close to your clients, but it's also a cost overhead that you should comprehend at the beginning of the contract negotiation. Are there specific inclusions? For example, customer damages to the assets. Are they included or excluded, and to what level? And are there features that you're quietly and silently building in which would increase your costs? One good example of that might be that the contract may deem that you have to have staff on site, when in fact you may argue that staff may not need to be on site to conduct the outcome-based service. So these are the kind of things you should watch for as you move forward, and it will smooth the path dramatically when you do. So my message there is detailed diligence at an early stage. You won't get unintended consequences, but please do then leave yourself a little bit of headroom and flexibility to adapt to customer requirements on the day. So the big change really here in moving from a traditional service model to an outcome-based one is, it sounds obvious, but your costs are now your own. All the costs are yours. And that can sound a bit kind of scary, but actually it's a brilliant thing, because every field service changes from being a revenue opportunity to a cost, but it also comes into your control. What you do with that service request now is something that you don't only have a duty to do, but you have control over. Spare parts are also included also, but again, you can start to run cost management streams to optimize your technicians' training, so you use fewer of them. You can change the sourcing of your parts sometimes to make them more reliable, because in your new model, you want spare parts to last as long as humanly possible. So it's a change of mindset and emphasis. And you, at all points, you must balance your process and your labor costs with your revenue. And in my world, I was spending kind of equal amounts of time managing my cost deck and the achievement of my service levels. And it was very important to split the time with good balance on those two aspects. Again, now you're in control of service calls in an outcome-based model. Your ability to solve those faults remotely is going to drive your margin, because as we all know, not everything requires a service technician visit. And with a good call center or contact center operation, many of those solves can now be calls can be solved remotely, and that's great for your margin. By the way, it's also great for the customer. The customer doesn't necessarily want to have to wait to tomorrow until someone comes to fix their asset in their office. So if you can solve it remotely, that's a legitimate SLA pass, let's say. You've passed that one. I'm going to move on to device data in a minute, but really as we moved into IoT and Industry 4 world, your ability to manage your incoming flow of device data is going to be, again, key to managing your margin, because it's going to become a key driver to your ability to solve remotely and choose what type of resource you're going to use to manage that service request. And that'll become very important for you. So your data really is now your best friend. And I know many of us have got data streams coming from the assets in our fleets. I think it would be an underestimate to say that that is now key to managing your cost and margins. What you do have to be a little bit careful of, though, is that you can have a ton of data, but my experience tells me that really the tricky part is to ensure that you can use, process, and suggest prognostic outcomes effectively with the data you have. So choose your data carefully and use it precisely. What you've got to be careful of is the phenomenon of the false positive, because imprecise data can quickly get a service operation out of control. Precise data, on balance, can reduce your service labor costs dramatically. And that 30% labor cost reduction by precise use of prognostics is not a fantasy. I've seen that done. So my message is, please do keep your data as your best friend, cultivate it, refine it, use all of your best staff to help you refine it also. But if you don't have the data now, well, okay, you don't have it. But all I would suggest then is start planning now to get the data in your next generation of kind of design for service initiatives inside your business. Even if you start with a few well-chosen elements of data, they can significantly move your cost style inside the business relatively quickly. So my final message really here is use the data you have. You might actually have more data than you think. For some years, Xerox was collecting data for its meter readings, and that was absolutely great. But it was also the first pillar in a series of pillars to help us do diagnostics. Because the first thing that you want to know when you're doing diagnostics is how many prints does the machine run in our case. So you're using this data for a different purpose, for meter reading purposes, but it can actually also help you for diagnostics if you think about it. So the message is use what you have. You might have more than you think. And don't try and manage this as a full transition without a really well-planned and managed pilot program. When I've done this before, it's really important to get all the parties around the table, work the flows, pilot with friendly customers or customers who have signed up to your pilot with goodwill, and you'll get lots of feedback then. But the good news is you can start to try out the effectiveness of your data and know where it's going to take you. So my thought would be choose a product or a customer segment or a geography, depending on what type of business you're running, and involve your clients in your planning. In my case, when I've seen this happen, the clients have been actually asking for this for some years. They've been asking you to smooth their workflow and help their production flow in their business. So if you can do this, you'll find many of the clients are very willing to come along on the journey with you. Then I would say form a small project team, staffed by knowledgeable people who understand the technicalities of fixing those assets. They should be people you trust. They should be respected by the wider team and your clients. And just from an operational point of view, I would say initially, don't shout about this. Just keep this relatively low profile. Do your learning from the pilot. You may want to run the pilot 2 or 3 different times in different manifestations. But when you're absolutely certain that the business benefits you're building are solid, are communicable and trustable, then you can start to begin to sell this as a service, an outcome-based service. So, and then summarize your learnings and keep this fresh, because you're not going to do this just once. The products will change, the individuals in your team will change, the processes will change, devices will become more capable of remote solve, for example. So keep this evergreen. Make sure this is not something that was done as a one-off program. Keep your best people on this and continue to refine your offering from that point of view. So those were just some experiences I'd had in managing an outcome-based operation. It's a huge opportunity if you get this right, and it gives you a lot of control that you didn't have before, which helps to plan you through the future with safety and good heart. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Kevin, I believe, who will take us through the next section.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. So, Amit, as Kevin is getting the slide under control, one of the things that we were keen to try and understand today was about how is perhaps service revenue impacted by the cost of services. Is that something that you could maybe perhaps cover in some of your early slides?
Yeah, absolutely, Ian. That's
Thank you.
Perfect. So let's maybe transition the full slide here, Kev. That would be great. So good morning, good afternoon to our listeners and participants. Thank you for joining us today. Basically, what Richard has just explained, and how Xerox has gone through the transition of becoming an outcome-based services company, where I guess print as a service or photocopy as a service is the way they ended up moving or moved in that direction. If you look at the traditional model for many companies, you sell your products. It could be physical products, it could be already services, it could be cloud-based software services or software solutions, and then you have some support, you have some repair, you have some maintenance. In the case of certain companies, you sell service contracts, and those are kind of the traditional models. And as we start going up this particular arrow here, we start looking at some different models that are tending towards what we call as fully service-based or asset as a service. And some things are included in there are like optimization services. So the ability to ensure that there's uptime guarantees for a particular product that is installed at a particular location. Data as a service, being able to actually get data from those products and actually share that information out with your customers who have them so that they can do something useful with that information. And then finally, outcome contracts and going really into the realm of asset as a service, where you're simply paying by use or by some certain parameters, and everything is included in that cost that the customer is paying to you, right? It's service, it's the product itself, and uptime becomes really, really important because you want them to use this all the time or as frequently as is desired or required by that particular industry, so that you can then get the revenue in as well. So the cost, as you can imagine, in the traditional model, also increases, if you go all the way from repair to asset as a service. So if you can transition to the next slide, Kev. And if you look at, in the asset-based model, going from repair all the way to asset as a service, what's really important here is that cost has to constantly be optimized. We don't want to, see costs just increase, right, in the asset as a service. Then your profitability is hit, your margins are hit. So how do you optimize costs? And that's really, the key to becoming an asset as a service company or an outcome-based, services company. And there are various, things that Richard pointed out that Xerox has done. But it's also, besides looking at your internal teams, cross-training them on various, so that they can support more than, one topic, improving your remote delivery capabilities in terms of remote diagnosis, introducing tools that help your, your internal teams actually manage these outcomes for your customers. and keep them, on a predictive path versus a reactive path. Those are all things that are important when we come to optimizing costs. So the effectiveness and efficiency of your service management processes and systems become crucial in an asset-based asset as a service solution. So you have to think of your service management processes more as predictive and versus reactive, and try and optimize those things as very often, as well as look at the systems that you have, the tools that you provide, and in particular in field service management, what are some of the improvements? It's not just sending someone out to the field. In COVID times, that even wasn't very easily done. So how do you provide your teams with more advanced capabilities? And that's where we start looking at optimizing cost.
Well, that's fantastic, Anna. And I think your point there, I will come back maybe under the question and answer session about guarantees and perhaps some terms that you might relate to. But you mentioned cross-training there, and if I can bring Kevin in now to perhaps maybe ask Kevin to expand a bit more about the changes that he has evidenced in workforces that might impact on Servitized business models.
Thanks, Ian. Well, let's have a look at an example. Light as a service. All right. We all get natural light as a free service. Well, that's a different story. We're talking about scenarios where companies, the manufacturer of light and lighting equipment and products, provide lighting as a service. For example, Philips. Philips does it today. So we have, for example, roads and tunnels authorities, hospitals, shopping centers, all the, perhaps big corporations and so on that require light as a service. And Philips, as an OEM, is providing that service, as opposed to the traditional model of just selling a product. Now let's have a look at this scenario. In the traditional model, where you buy and sell, let's call it buy and sell model for the sake of this seminar, a webinar. Roads and tunnels authorities are responsible for maintaining their lights, their lightings. If they have an internal team, or they may use some service providers, contractors. But at the end, the responsibility is to the end customer to maintain these lighting and making sure they do inspections, they do replacement, and so on and so forth. So a service is actually a component of the collaboration of the roads and tunnels authority, end customer, and perhaps some service contractors. If we go to the light as a service model, that's going to change, and that changes the equation of the supply network of lighting. Now the end customer is not responsible for maintaining the lights or inspection. They just pay based on performance, based on consumption, and the expectation based on, of course, different models of the contracts is that it works. There is some measurements about how measure the provision of light, but at the end, the maintenance and service becomes the responsibility of the OEM and probably their service providers and contractors. So what we are actually observing in here is a rearrangement of service organizations, because the service and field service has different owners perhaps now, and because the OEMs cannot take all this load of services into their organizations, there is an opportunity to grow for contractors in here. So that's really what we are observing in here. First, it requires a tighter organizational links between these participants of the service ecosystem, let's call them, OEMs and service providers and end customers, to mention a few. And then there is a rearrangement of the agreement of who does service and how and so on. So that requires a change in the workforce. Whoever was doing field service for repairing and inspecting light, perhaps in this case, requires now a different organizational setting.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Can I perhaps maybe ask Richard to comment? Because I think with your work at Xerox, Richard, you had a significant level of interaction with your field service engineers and your end customers. That frame that Kevin has just showed there about the OEM and service provider customer, is that something that resonates with you, or were there additional challenges that you identified?
Yeah, I resonate with what Kevin's saying. I can see the shift towards the service provider landscape. Speaking as an OEM, the early adoption of service providers as service delivery for us, of course, meant from a systems point of view, some significant interfaces to be built, and that's probably still true. But I always felt my biggest responsibility as the OEM was to ensure that whatever my team did, it was to enable the service provider to carry my brand. So I wouldn't want to ever be putting a service provider, those growing service providers, in a situation where they didn't feel that the OEM had got their back, if you see what I mean. So I think for the OEM, it's a different set of responsibilities now. It's tempting to think that the OEM would step back in that situation, but in fact, the good OEMs should be the people on the front foot, helping their service providers deliver that outcome-based service, giving them the data, giving them the good diagnostics in order that they can carry the brand through to the end customer and make it transparent for the end customer, as Kevin was pointing out.
Fabulous, thanks, Richard. So Amit, perhaps with Kevin's scenario there, is there anything you can tell us about what happens to the goals of the service ecosystem participants and perhaps how they might be optimized?
Absolutely. If you look at, again, the traditional models has been you do service and you charge for it, either time and material as per particular service incident, or you have a service agreement with your customers. So in the case of time and material, the more you service, the more you can charge, and that leads to better margins. But is that really what customers are looking for? They don't want to be having someone on site fixing machines all the time. They want a reliable service. They want a reliable product. So, the focus has to be really on building better products, more reliable products that see this uptime, that the organization is promising. So for the OEM, then if we move to a service-sized business model, every service is a cost, and we mentioned this before. So how do I reduce my costs? First of all, I don't want to go on site and service it, if at all, never required, because I want a reliable service. Of course, there's always going to be some maintenance and planned maintenance that's required, but that has to be cost, and it has to be properly organized as to who delivers those services. In some very distributed markets, you may use some service providers in certain markets that you rely on, that have been your partners for years, that you've brought in along with the journey, and you have helped them optimize their cost. In other cases, you want to take this in-house and completely own that experience with the end customer as well. So it's a little bit of mix and match in many situations, Ian. It's not one kind of size fits all for every customer and every OEM. You would have to go case by case and see, do we do this in-house? Do we use a set of trusted service providers in certain distributed markets?
Okay, thank you, Amit. And perhaps, Kevin, we talked earlier about the workforce, and I'm just wondering whether there was any implications for the skills of the service workforce on that model that Amit has just described.
Yes, exactly. Ian, this optimization requires some prerequisites. That what we call it now a distributed or revised skills management. Perhaps I can start with an example of if I have my machine, I don't know, washing machine, could be a simplistic example at the moment, but now maybe everybody can relate to that. If my washing machine is broken, I call a service provider. They send someone, for example, to inspect. And I have to pay a call-out fee, perhaps a travel fee, and so on. And this inspection determines, as part of this inspection, is determined that, Okay, then we need to do such and such and such. We need to buy this spare parts, order it, and someone else later on will bring this. So I have to pay twice, one for inspection, one for now service, and so on. Just an example. In this model, because as an end customer, I have to pay all of that. In the servitized model, however, it's different. Because as end customer, I have my fees, I have my contract, I have my subscription, and that's it. Therefore, it's up to the service provider or OEM to optimize that. So if I send someone for inspection, perhaps it would make sense that I have multi-skill people, multitask people, that they can repair it on the spot as well. So I save one call out, one travel already. That's what we mean by multi-skill, multitasking people. And you cannot have all the skills everywhere in the world. That's impossible. You cannot have the most experienced and the most experienced experts in your field everywhere. Therefore, you have to have a balance. You have now some experience, some newbies, and all of that. And we need to find some ways of distributed skills management, being remote assistance via phone and augmented reality, virtual reality, all these, let's say, recently highlighted technologies. That COVID, for example, was an accelerator only. Otherwise, it's a natural need for the movement that we have at the moment in our business models towards a servitized models. We need to have that, and this pandemic was an accelerator for that, to have remote, somebody sitting in the head office via phone, via video conferencing, and so on. They can guide the less experienced people who in the past used to do inspections only. Now they could do repair because they get support. Knowledge management systems can also assist in this here. That's what we call it now, a concept of distributed skills.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. One of the things that is jumping out at me is that we're talking about this transfer of cost. So the cost is moving between the customer and the end user by the models. And there seems to be a tension here between the amount of risk that a company would accept and deliver it, or is there something that advanced services and servitization helps with that shared risk, or perhaps the co-creation of value so the risk is not so dominant? Is that something that you've experienced? And just an open question to Richard, Amit, or Kevin.
Well, we're talking about risk. Perhaps we have content in some other slides. I translate risk in the asset management in this way. Traditionally, and I mean, so far, often at the moment, is up to the end customer to decide whether they want to have more repair or more periodic and preventative maintenance. It's up to me at the end, as the end customer. If I pay more contract and so on, then I have more preventative from the service provider and less repair cost. And it's up to me to balance this out. Do I need to have more repair or more periodic? So where am I with my assets? This equation,
sorry, Kevin.
Change now.
Yep. Sorry, just to build on what Kevin's saying, I think one of the things that often happens at the beginning of a servitization initiative is that the OEM, if it's an OEM, baselines their current costs. So they get a pretty good handle on where the cost risk currently lives in their non-servitized model. If you've got a good handle on that, well, it's a good starting place to do the pricing activity up front and to try and replicate the old world margin in an outcome-based world. But to do that, you should baseline your costs very closely. And you should probably also try to make some predictions about how an outcome-based model may change the profile of labor or parts usage, for example. And Kevin makes a very good point, because with the skills part of it, one of the things we were always doing at Xerox is looking for ways to optimize the skill portfolio. So for example, through various design for service initiatives over the years, certain parts were recategorized as customer replaceable. So no technician needed to go on site for that. If it was a certain category of part, we would just FedEx that part to the customer with the instructions, and that became the norm. So again, it comes back to the data, because if the data is right, it will help you make that diagnosis. And all of those things help to manage that risk, but it's best to manage it up front, I would say.
Okay, I caught you nodding there, Amit. Is that something that resonates as well?
Absolutely, Ian. So maybe to take an example of one of our customers who's just started this journey of servitization, and they're actually going down the same path as Richard has recommended. Do it small, make some experiences with the whole servitization concept before you kind of roll it out globally. So this is a medical device company. They build machines that are used in surgeries and specialized surgeries in hospitals all over the US and now in EMEA and in APJ as well. And for them, they were traditionally selling these machines, which are obviously very expensive. And then they have service contracts, which customers would buy because you don't want these machines to be faulty in any way, right? Because they're used in surgery. But now they're going to the servicized model. They are not selling the machines anymore. At least the pilot is that they just sell, a cost per surgery. So the goal for this company now is to make sure there's uptime. I go back to that concept. You have to be able to use the machine all the time, right? There should be no downtime because every surgery is a billable, engagement. And from that perspective, what diagnostics can you collect from those machines that help you, fix issues remotely? So optimizing your costs, ensuring that you have certain coverage and field service if there's an event that needs to be handled physically by a field service technician, but also looking at parts which can be replaced in the field by the customer, going back to Richard's point. So all of these are coming together, but starting small, with a pilot in a particular region is how they're going forward with that. Yeah.
Okay, that's a fantastic example, Anna, and I think it's one of these things that when we are working with companies, we are pushing them towards that outcome-based activity, because that's both where the value to the customer is and the margins to the provider of that service. So I think it's a really good point that you make in terms of the way that companies look at it and how they have to have the systems in place. So Kevin, we have talked about skills in management, but one of the things that I'd asked that we perhaps picked up in the webinar today was about how you saw assets as a service strategy and how these might influence the wider service ecosystem. Is that something you could perhaps respond to?
Let's have a look at our example, the light example, or lighting. In the buy and sell model, let's say, we have an OEM who is selling some products to the end customer. And end customer, as we said, is responsible for making inspection, arranging at least, or planning inspection, or ensuring this is done, and repair and maintenance for the end product, being light, for example, or lighting in different industries. So, so that actually contributes to the traditional terminologies being used, like asset management versus field service. Being asset management, I'm responsible to look after my production facilities, my assets, and here field service for those who want to now maintain that. But if we are talking about servitized model, so we go away from this buy and sell model, then we see a shift in here. Basically, the OEM and or service provider are responsible for maintaining this. So they do asset management and they do field service, and customer just pays the fees, outcome performance based. So asset management and field service now becoming closer in this model. And if you look at it in a fully servitized world, the assets of this OEM are actually provided by another one, being now production machinery manufacturer, that they do maintenance for these guys. So theoretically, in an ideal servitized world, we see a chain of field service operations that they do asset management as well. So it's very hard now to distinguish between this concept of and systems and processes and organizations of asset management versus field service. They're close, now they're getting closer to each other as we do more service-based businesses. And that requires that field service and asset management concepts, organizations, and solutions to have overlaps and perhaps borrow from each other and learn from each other. So we'll see, as now Richard mentioned, data, monitoring, increasing demand for preventative, predictive, and proactive maintenance, because now maintenance versus now repair budget was a customer responsibility. Now it's not anymore. So we need to, because at the end of the day, any moment of breakdown based on your contract, of course, could impact the OEM's now bottom line revenue. And that requires a close proximity and overlap of service management and field service. Now, so long we've had concepts of reliability-centered maintenance, for those asset-intensive industries, which is an asset management topic. Then field service, because now in this new world is going to do asset management on behalf of the customer. Then we need to now borrow these concepts, borrow these processes and tools towards a resilient field service management, for example. And we've seen this already started in the market. So in the solution provider space, we see now Salesforce, a sales and service body, solution provider, is now getting closer to ServiceMax, that they do asset management, they do asset 360, and they do field service. So they're getting closer now to do joint works and so on. Also on the now SAP service portfolio, we see field service now reorganized within the asset management portfolio of products. Also, Microsoft is moving towards that direction. So what are one of the main aspects of this move is that now we need to rearrange our structure, our concepts, and of tools and processes for field service and asset management to be like hand to hand. And that requires, of course, people and people to do that.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Kevin. I'm going to just pose one question to Richard before we move on to the next slide. And Richard, we've picked up upon the opportunities in your presentation at the start for field service. Have you, as a result of Kevin and Amit's presentation and discussion, identified any other ways where field service might be enhanced?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, picking up on one of Kevin's points, when we talk about moving into the asset tracking and asset management world, one of the things that customers will wish you to do is, if you have prior knowledge of something that's going to break, in the new world, don't let it break. Use all your prognostic abilities to make sure it doesn't. Because if in a big production environment like the ones Kevin was describing, you don't want it to break, or you don't want it to just break less often. That's the old world. The new world is use your data to manage the customer's uptime proactively. Because for a customer in a production environment, they want to use the asset when they want to use it. It will probably sit unused for a high proportion of its life, but when it's needed, it's needed. So again, if you use the data proactively, you can probably give those customers a good view on when it's likely to break, and you can prevent it on their behalf. And that's a big change in mindset.
Yeah. That's really helpful, Richard. Thank you. And perhaps Amit, maybe following on from Kevin's slide there, they've talked about people. Is there anything you'd like to perhaps add to that session?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, It's obviously a transformational change that companies will have to go through to become, a servitized model, or to move towards the servitized model. And with that comes the need for organizational change management. It is the need to bring people with you on that journey, because we are asking more of people in this way, to learn more, to be multi-skilled, as as Kev pointed out. So there's definitely the need for a proper strategy to be to put together, but also to have that culture and the top-down, spirit that you bring to such a change, and to be an executive sponsor from a leadership perspective to take people through this journey. At the end of the day, why are we doing this, right? It's to have more predictable revenue, to be better engaged with your customers, to have products that are sticky, that will be there for ever and ever at a customer in various versions, obviously, but to have a long-term relationship with your end customers. And this is how you get to that outcome with an outcome-based service. If you're always delivering to specific outcomes, your products are always going to be used by your customers. So
Yeah.
getting your employees to go along on this journey is very important.
Fabulous, thank you. Well, perhaps, Christina, if I can get us to move on to the slide with the panelists. We have got questions starting to come in. We have got one from Sophia Bottaro, and she's saying, first, thank you all for this webinar. She'd like to ask, what is the best strategy to choose the right way for pricing an outcome-based service? So is that something one of the speakers would like to pick up, please?
Well, I can have some comments on that. Thank you for the question. That's an area of research and exploration itself. Really, that's a huge area. We have some other materials, including webinars and reports that we can share with you about how pricing. Obviously, it depends on the situation, on the asset, on your customer, and on your relationship. And what I could say in these 2 minutes is that there is no correct answer. There is no wrong answer. It all depends on the use case of what you do. If it is like performance-based, if it right, there are other ways of provisioning this service. Therefore, it really depends on your organization and the service you provide, relationship with your customer, and how would you like, as Ian said, like, we know, and Richard pointed out, the service provider or OEM, before starting servitization, they have a baseline of what are the cost elements, where are we at the cost, and to get to the higher revenue, how could this pricing, considering our additional costs, for example, this field service that becomes the cost of the OEM, could look like. That I could comment.
Okay, thank you. Amit, Richard, would you like to add anything to that? Or
yeah, that's kind of why I was mentioning the baselining, Ian, because if it's a new market the OEM's entering and there isn't a well-known market price for the service, well, you kind of create it from the cost deck up with a target margin, because really there isn't a well-known market price. If you're entering with into an existing market with a well-known market price for the service, then it's kind of almost backwards. You're going to go from the price in the market and then manage your cost deck aggressively to ensure that you can hit the target margin that you need to do. So it really depends on the situation you're entering.
Okay,
thank you. Amit, anything to contribute
to
that?
I would say, just again, going back to the example of one of my customers, the way they did it is, as Richard has mentioned, they first of all baseline, what is the revenue you get per equipment today? Like when you actually sell it, that's the revenue. Here's the revenue you get from, selling service contracts, extended warranties, and those kinds of things. So then you have, a picture of existing, revenues. And then you have a picture of existing cost to serve. And that is, all tracked in their ERP system. So once you get those two, you put that together and say, okay, if I'm going to a usage-based service in the future, and I need to make at least, similar revenue, or if I'm optimizing my costs, the revenue could be a little bit lower, that's okay. But the goal is to have a long-term contract with the customer. So what's the minimum time frame then? Do I have a 5-year agreement? And do I have a certain expectation that I'm setting with my customer that you have to use this equipment this frequently every month so that I can get a certain run rate of revenue, associated for the next 5 years? So those are some things, again, complex contractual negotiations, as you can imagine, but putting this together does take time, and it does take a few iterations. So you will not get it right the first time.
Lovely, thank you, Amit. And Sophia, I hope that has answered your question. Please contact us. We do have a lot more material on different types of revenue models, but these are perhaps things that you would need to build once you had the value proposition and the delivery of the value system created. But please contact us at the Advanced Services Group, and we'll do what we can to help. We have a follow-up question from Arne Sett, and he's relating to the comments about people, and people. And he's asking, how do we see the increasing shortage of skilled labour affecting the trend of servitization? And perhaps maybe starting Kevin again, and then maybe work back.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And perhaps I would like to rephrase this topic. We don't see a shortage of labor. We see transformation in labor. We see people now very familiar and very comfortable with mobile phones and using technology and so on. They're replacing the old people. And that's what we call it, the concept of distributed skills and the processes to support that can assist in here. So we have new people, we have the skilled people sitting now, for example, in the head office somewhere else, and they could connect with the technology both are comfortable with. And then another component of this skill is the knowledge, is the technology, artificial intelligence, or whatever you'd like to call it, that also contributes to that. So the form of labor is going to change, and the form of support is going to change. But at the end of the day, we need someone to go inside and put the spanner in, and that should exist. That's not going to be replaced.
Okay, thank you. Amit, if you wanted to jump in at that point, was there anything you'd like to add to Kevin's point?
I think just, as Kev mentioned in his presentation, a few things that have to be considered, newer age tools like augmented reality, virtual reality, where maybe a physical presence on site is not required, but also the use of knowledge management solutions, very, very important. Don't just rely on, your team using that knowledge management solution. If you have some trusted service providers that are providing that feet on the ground for you, share that knowledge with those people too, so that they can be more efficient and optimized in how they deliver service.
Okay, thank you. And I think perhaps this is maybe one for Amit and Kevin, from Andreas Schroeder. And he's asking, you describe a fully servitized future based on a network of dependencies across integrated service providers. What risks would that create?
I could start. First of all, it requires people, and you may not have it. That's the first risk. And the second one is that from the OEM point of view, it requires heavy investment to start with. That's heavy investment. These two actually immediately comes to my mind. And Amit, if you have any other, please.
Well, it's, as we said, in a servitized business model, it's all cost to the OEM. So again, optimizing your service provider cost, if you go down the route of using service providers for certain markets, for certain line of products, you have to make sure that their costs are also optimized, but not at the cost of providing lower customer satisfaction or a poorer service to your customers, right? So how do you balance that is one of the risks that have to be considered.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'm trying to get one more question in if I can before we wrap up some of the other material, but one for you, Richard. I think Dean Perry has asked, it seems to me that to ensure that there is a smooth communication with the OEM and the tech, there should be some better form of documentation rather than paper files and PDFs. What would the panel recommend to increase the efficiency with documentation?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, one of the things that I was involved in my last time at Xerox was to integrate the documentation all the way through the chain. So what our biggest community in the field service fix now was actually not in the field at all. It was becoming the call center. So we actually spent a lot of time making sure the scripts and the flows of data for the call center people were very tight. But I think Dean raises a very good point. It's an ongoing process of refresh. And to make sure that the live field data is coming back into the service process. Oh, and by the way, it goes right back to the design house who originally designed the asset. They would want to know also what they need to update in terms of the service documentation based on field experience. So I think it's a really good point. I think there's a lot more work to do on it, by the way, but if you get that right, it's very powerful.
Great, thanks, Richard. I think there's a couple of things to pick up on in terms of the comments coming through. Christina, yes, we will get more information to you on pricing. Paul Singh, thank you very much for your comments. It was great to see you. And Sophia, thank you, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. One of the things I wanted just to do to close, when my timer has gone off, is to just reiterate that we're having a 3-day in-person event in Birmingham this year in the UK. There will also be a live stream to the event. So I think Humaira has put down the registration details and the link in the chat function. We'd love to see you, as would our sponsors and our exhibitors, because they're very proud of what they've achieved. And we want to work with them to get as many people involved in servitization to ultimately have a difference in field service and wider operations. And one of the things that we do to help is we do have a lot of material available on our website. We produce mini guides, and I was delighted earlier when, Kevin, you mentioned the washing machine example. We've just created a mini guide round about engineering design for service, which included a gamified example of a washing machine and how that changes over time and the way that the design infects that. So again, you'll find details of our materials there. And just lastly, for me, I think we're more or less bang on time, is really just to say thank you for all our speakers today, to Richard, to Kevin, to Amit. I know it's taken a lot of time to prepare your materials and to get ready for the questions from the delegates and for the wider panel. But it's been a pleasure having you today, and really look forward to keeping in touch and building upon the momentum and the opportunities that sit within field service. And for those other delegates and participants that were on the group, you'll find some of the contact details there. We are on LinkedIn and on Twitter, but you will get a live recording of this webinar sent to you because you had registered, and we will make materials available and the contact details for Richard, for Kevin, and for Amit. So on behalf of myself and the Advanced Services Group and the wider team, many thanks to Christina and Humaira for making everything happen. And it's been a pleasure. And for those that have got a football interest, I wish you all the best in the football this evening, whether you're from England, Denmark, or wherever you come from on Sunday. So thanks all, and pleasure to meet you all. Thank you.
That's entertainment.
Thanks, everyone.
Entertainment
Okay.
as a service.
Thanks, Kevin.
everyone.
Thanks, Amit.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks all.